However, by thinking, do we arrive at understanding? Some of us do. Not really. It's such a play, isn't it? I'm reading a book I haven't totally finished. I don't know which of you gave it to me at Christmas. I forget. I get so many books, it takes me years to read them. It's called The History of God. Morley's read it also, by Karen Armstrong. Do I recommend it? No. Only a wonk like me would read a book like that, or Morley, but it's very interesting. It's limited to the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, in terms of the evolving definitions and so forth. But the basic theme is what we see always, the difference between the mind and the heart. Now, the mind gets a lot of brickbats around here and in the mystical traditions, and that's very good. And yet, how many of you ever stop thinking when you're conscious? How many of you can meditate and still your thoughts? You see, the thoughts become a doorway through which we see the world, we reason about the world, and if there were no beliefs, in fact, science has beliefs too. They call it a hypothesis. And so the mind is central. If we didn't have reason, would we question anything? Would we only be, I don't know, I love animals too, but would we only be but animals and so forth, living instinctually? And so it's a divine play. We read a poem like Morley just read, and it opens our hearts. But those are words, mere words, symbols for a reality that goes far beyond the words. And yet we do it all the time, you see. There was a man, a Jewish man, and living in America with his family, and he got transferred to another town for a new job. And as has happened, I know even in India, this sort of took place, and in Padma's life in South America, it sort of took place. So they moved to a new town, and he looked for the best school for his son. But he was Jewish, and he was an atheist. But the best school he could find was a Catholic school, a very common occurrence historically around the world. So he sent his son to this Catholic school, and it was going along pretty darn good for a while. And one day the young boy came home and said, "Dad, I learned about Heavenly Father and the Son of God and the Holy Ghost." And the atheist Jewish guy said, oh, he got all upset. And he said, "Son, I want you to know something and learn it for good. There's only one God, and we don't believe in him." As Yoganandaji said, your beliefs won't save you. In times of crisis, ill health, disease, suffering, and so forth, with what we see in the world today, what you believe isn't really worth that much. It's who we are and how we feel. In the book, Karen Armstrong's book, the theme that runs through the three Abrahamic faiths in describing the evolution is basically the contrast between mind and heart. You know, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they retained, and to this day, but not as much, but much longer than the Roman Western Church, they retained the appreciation. I think of the Greek Orthodox monks up on, that's what that famous monastery is, Athos, I think it is. Anyway, and I have read the lives of many of the Orthodox saints, even in the 20th century, and it's so much devotion and inner experience. The hesychasts preserved and created, I think, the Jesus prayer for those who know it, and it's really the same as japa and mantra and practicing the presence. And I'm almost finished. Morley's helping edit a new book I have on the Yoga Sutras talking about meditations. And the interesting thing about that, because of the turbulence of the mind, what the best technique is to focus the mind one-pointedly. in various ways, on the breath, on an image, whatever, in order to clear the mind, to go beyond images. And so this great tradition in the Eastern Orthodox retained that mysticism that is at the heart of what we offer here, the inner path of meditation. This is the hive, but without the honey of the heart's natural love, the hive is just another building. And so that dichotomy existed, and in the Roman version of the Western Church, of course it was there. There were great mystical saints in Roman Catholicism and even later in Protestantism, but perhaps not quite as much. In any case, the current is always there for those who seek and know. But nonetheless, in the Western Church, we all know, the mind, the rational, and when the Protestants revolted, they threw the baby out with the bathwater. They smashed the idols of the saints, and then the church, the Western Catholic Church, responded to that by also eschewing mystical traditions and being very scholastic and very rational and so on and so forth. Those of you who have studied the life of Padre Pio know that this ran to the heart. His deep connection with Christ and with the divine light was such that he was viewed with skepticism even by the Vatican. They didn't trust it. It was superstitious. So this is the great battle that goes on. And because our particularly Western culture, but let's face it, it's the same in India and China, and for all intents and purposes at this point in civilization, we think we know something because we can define it, because we can say it. It's a great start, actually. I think, but however, back when I was a child, or not a child, but young, and was an altar boy and would go to the Mass to serve at the Mass, and I had any number of uplifting experiences, at least one that I recall with the sun rising when I forgot what I was supposed to do and the priest had to turn around and tell me, ring the bell or something or other, So here's the thing. The heart knows, but what if it doesn't? And that is to say, well, as it says in Sankhya Darshana, the philosophy of Sankhya, God, how's it go? Ishwara Asidhah, God cannot be proved. Of course, cannot be disproved either. And many people mistakenly feel that therefore Sankhya Darshana is agnostic. That's not at all the truth. It's just that you cannot prove God through logic. And so in this book, which I found very interesting, all through the Muslims and their great high culture in whenever that was, in Spain and the Middle East and so forth, they drew on, as did St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, on Aristotle and Plato. They were the Neoplatonists and so forth. The strong wanting to prove God through logic. Well, it's good as far as it goes, I guess, but you can't really do it, okay? And yet we each have within us, this is what C.S. Lewis said in his Mere Christianity book, each of us has, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but each of us have a conscience. We know when we've done something we don't feel good about. We also have even more widespread than conscience, which isn't universal, I'm sorry to say, but we all have a desire for perfection. We may not use that term, but we want to be successful, we want to be beautiful, we want to be popular, we want to be rich, whatever it is. There's some innate impulse towards perfection, by whatever name you call it. Those are some of the rational approaches to, and of course the divine intelligence. Who can, through the study of science, who can study this world and not just be in awe as Einstein was? But again, that can only take you so far. I think back to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson rewrote the New Testament because they were anti-miracles. I mean, all that superstition stuff, Son of God, Trinity, they had nothing to do with it. He rewrote it to show that Jesus Christ was basically a good egg and maybe a spiritual teacher and so forth. So the age of reason has given us many things, but it hasn't fulfilled our hearts. But the thing is this, if you don't, I describe myself young and having that innate feeling. What does a young boy think about beliefs anyway? I wasn't about belief. I, like many of you, were drawn in some way through the heart. But what if you don't have that? And so this is the great contribution to the world's treasury of knowledge, Yogananda says in the Kriya Yoga chapter, is the link between the breath and the mind, which is really the heart, but he used the word mind. That beautiful song, that song, by the way, that we sung is dedicated to the Egyptian version of Divine Mother, Isis. Be still, as the Bible says, and know. And so through meditation, we can learn to still the mind through concentration. And in time, the heart's natural love appears. Now, of course, what is your motivation? That's the struggle most meditators have, is the motivation to meditate, the voice that says, I don't want to meditate. And so that's where the use of the mind, the beautiful poetry. I took 4 years of Latin and I studied for the priesthood and all that stuff. But when I think of Sanskrit, for many years, do a mantra or even just try to read the word. I have said this before. I feel the power of the vibration of mantra. But the interesting thing is, I see among, it's not so much for me, but I see among those who still are Catholics, including my brother, who's a Latin Rite Catholic, that even Latin, which cannot be considered a sacred language on its own, historically, etc. But over the years, sort of like some of the mantras that have acquired power through their recitation by high souls. I could recite the entire Latin Mass. There are certain phrases, and I hear people say this, they feel the power of those words which they deem to be sacred. And so, in other words, we're a whole person. And the mind can lead us if we're open to the heart. And in fact, in a civilization like ours, that's pretty much the norm. We go by the mind. But yet, unless we can learn to be still, to observe. Some of the practices that I have found helpful, because what I've learned in 50 years of meditation is that if you meditate in the way that you brush your teeth, twice a day, when your mind's thinking of something else, it might be okay. But unless your life is a life of meditation, and what is that? Openness, quietness of mind, awareness, connection. Unless you live that way throughout the days, even if it's a struggle, like doing a mantra japa or the Jesus prayer, it's a struggle to remember. Anybody here, some of you have read the lovely book, the Pilgrim's, what's it called? The Pilgrim's Way, or whatever it is, about the Russian Orthodox fellow who, as in the olden days, and as in India too, went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He walked from Moscow to Jerusalem. It's a long walk. And throughout, he recited the Jesus prayer, And so unless you really internalize and focus and feel, the feeling has to lead you to it. And so we're blessed with, when I study the teachings of Yogananda, it's such a gift to our age, Because yes, he talks about many esoteric things, and yes, he talks about, the astral world and the causal world and all these things which we find exciting and interesting, some of us. But, as in the poem read today, he also gives the power of devotion, the power of the heart. In my early life, when I first met Swami Kriyananda, I would have said to myself, I guess I said to myself, I didn't feel like I was a devotional person. I don't think that's really true when I look back, but that's sort of how I saw it. Swami himself was much more intellectual in his expression, and very interesting talks he'd give, and I just ate it up like a sponge. But he said, patience is the quickest way to God. And I said, wait a minute, that's not logical. How can patience be the quickest way to anything? But then there's the tortoise and the hare. And so through his vibration, through even his intellectuality, there was a vibration conveyed, you see. And that's really who we are and what we have to offer, our vibration. Whether we express ourselves outwardly as a bhakti, as a person of devotion, or as a jnani, more of the perception and intellect, or whether we are very serviceful and active in our tendencies, at the heart of it is the vibration. And the gift that's been given us is how to reach the center of the heart's natural love by relaxing the body, quieting the mind, and opening the heart. And so this technique throughout the day of becoming aware of your space, listening to the space between the words, your words, others' words. In other words, feeling is the doorway. And when we meditate, we should always open the door of the heart first. Yes, we look up and so forth. The heart center, I cognize the center of the Empyrean as a point of intuitive perception in my heart. This is the divine ego. This is the enlightened ego. When we lift up, we receive inspiration. We get perspective. We get understanding. But the divine self lives here. And yet we have to go through the process. It's more complicated than is appropriate for today. But nonetheless, it's the heart that knows. But on the other hand, it's the heart that entangles us. That's why we have to lift the natural love of the heart in order to perceive the truth that shall make us free. And only through a certain degree of purification, which includes stillness and quietness and so forth, perception, awareness, connection, and that kind of thing, does the natural love of the heart, as it were, arise naturally. And so it's a process, but it's a great gift that is coming to humanity. I think of millions of people, I presume millions of people by this point meditate, usually practicing mindfulness. Well, mindfulness by itself doesn't uplift you into superconsciousness. It's just me and my thoughts. Very powerful practice, however, becoming more aware and sort of cleaning up the subconscious mind. But until we ourselves, through that awakening within, realize that we are something much greater than the subconscious or the random thoughts that tumble through my mind, then we're not going to get particularly far. But it's a good start. And even among us who seek divine communion, how often does that happen? You see, we open up to something much greater than ourselves, and we can't see the transformation that takes place within us. And this is why, in fact, today's reading is called How to Study the Scriptures. Because they convey from the realization, and not all of them, we've all read parts of the Old Testament, and it's pretty gruesome and not particularly inspiring in parts, but so not all of them are the same. Not all, quote, scriptures have been transmitted by people of the highest realization. But nonetheless, When I read the Vedas, I just shake my head. It's like, huh? But then you read the Upanishads, which sort of say, okay, I'm going to tell you what it's really about. You can see that those were written in a time very close to our own. I'm not going to get into the yugas, many of you know them. But we need that handle of understanding in order to move forward. And so I'd like to end with a little reading, since we did our whispers first, from one of my favorite chapters, Years in My Master's Hermitage, chapter 12 of the autobiography, in which he talks about the technique of reading the scriptures. I'll just read a few snippets. This is Yogananda's time with his guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, in his hermitage. Among the philosophers, professors, lawyers, and scientists who came to the hermitage, a number arrived for their first visit with the expectation of meeting an orthodox religionist. A supercilious smile or a glance of amused tolerance occasionally betrayed that the newcomers anticipated nothing more than a few pious platitudes. Yet later, their reluctant departure would bring an express conviction that Sri Yukteswar had shown precise insight into their specialized fields. A noted chemist once crossed swords with Sri Yukteswar. The visitor would not admit the existence of God, inasmuch as science has devised no means of detecting him. So, you have inexplicably failed to isolate the supreme power in your test tubes? Sri Yukteswar's gaze was stern. I recommend an unheard of experiment. Examine your thoughts unremittingly for 24 hours. Then wonder no more at God's absence. Then he goes on later to describe how in eastern Bengal, where he watched the procedure of a renowned teacher, Dabru Balav, his method, at once simple and difficult, was common in ancient India. He gathered his disciples around him in the sylvan solitudes. The Holy Bhagavad Gita was open before them. Steadfastly, they looked at one passage for half an hour, then closed their eyes. Another half hour slipped away. The master gave a brief comment. Motionless, they meditate again for an hour. Finally, the guru spoke. Have you understood? Yes, sir, one in the group ventured this assertion. No, not fully. Seek the spiritual vitality that has given these words the power to rejuvenate India century after century. Another hour passed in silence. The master dismissed the students, turned to Sri Yukteswar. Do you know the Bhagavad Gita? No, sir, not really, though my eyes and mind have run through its pages many times.